For my infamous speech, I chose Richard Ramirez. Richard Ramirez is a serial killer who stalked Los Angeles County in California in the mid-1980s. He was born in 1960 out in Texas to a Mexican-American working family. Authorities dubbed him the Night Stalker because his attacks happened at night. His crimes started as simple burglaries to try and find valuables to trade in for cash for drug money. He murdered 22 people, disabled one elderly woman, and brutally raped and sodomized another woman after murdering her husband right in front of her. His murder spree ran from April 10, 1984 up until August 6, 1985. When authorities figured out it was Ramirez who was committing these brutal crimes, his mugshot was posted all over the news, and a group of people found him trying to steal a car to escape and ended up beating him in the street until police broke up the fight and arrested Ramirez on the spot. Ramirez's crimes were from the rape and sodomy, ranged anywhere from rape and sodomy to mutilation. Within his murders, one of his victims was stabbed so severely that they were almost decapitated, as well as robbery. Ramirez's life wasn't easy growing up. His father was extremely abusive, and his cousin Mike, who was a Vietnam War vet, and Ramirez saw him as his hero. When Ramirez was a young kid, his uncle, who suffered from PTSD, shot and murdered his wife right in front of Ramirez, and her blood ended up spattering on his face. His uncle also showed Richard pictures of the Vietnamese women and what the American soldiers were doing to them, raping them, gagging them, murdering them, the whole 9 yards. And these ended up reflecting in Ramirez's own murders. He also suffered from a drug addiction, especially cocaine. When he was younger, he smoked marijuana with his cousin on a daily basis. An interesting thing I learned about Ramirez after reading the book written by Philip Carlo was that he loved to torture the bodies post-mortem, whether it was sexually or brutally. One of his victims, he gauged her eyes out and sliced her chest with a T. He also murdered the men quickly and tortured the women for hours. He almost had a vendetta. It was almost like he had a vendetta against women, which I think stemmed from his cousin Mike and the pictures he used to show him of the Vietnamese women. As Ramirez got older, his drug habits went from just smoking marijuana to doing cocaine and other hard drugs. He was also born epileptic, and when he was younger, he would constantly have seizures. I think his cousin Mike had a lot of influence on who he was as a person because he witnessed him murdering his wife. He saw all the violence that Mike saw, and it almost kind of turned him on and intrigued him. Ramirez also was satanic and worshipped Satan. Ramirez's first victim, Jenny Vincow, who was 79 years old, he broke into her house, and when he couldn't find anything worth of value to trade in for money, he murdered her, slit her throat, and was so aroused by her murder that he had sex with her corpse. He was sick, twisted, and sadistic, and showed no remorse for his victims. A husband and wife that he murdered, he tortured the wife to such an extent that I wouldn't wish that on my worst enemy. After reading his book, I was traumatized, and there were nights where I would dream of what happened and not be able to sleep. The only reason he got caught by authorities is he was getting sloppy and leaving more and more clues as to who he was. Police repeatedly found the same shoe footprint outside of the windows he broke into, and he was seen by one person who also gave the police his description, which led to his mugshot being released and eventually his arrest. I think I chose Richard Ramirez for this speech because he's not as well known as murderers like BTK or Jeffrey Dahmer, Charles Manson, Gary Ridgway. However, he caused more terror and fear in one county than I think these killers have combined. Ramirez also didn't have a preference for his victim. He didn't choose just men, just women. He chose whatever house he broke into, and he chose to torture the women and violently, brutally murder them. I think he was so violent and his crimes were so demonic that it's the kind of thing you would think another human couldn't do to another. He was a killer I had never heard about, and when I saw the book written about him, I was hooked and did nothing but read it for 2 days and just researched after him afterwards. I've always had a fascination with serial killers, and he's been my favorite since I've read about him. I find it completely intriguing how he stalked, murdered, and tortured his victims without showing any remorse, and then someone ended up falling in love with this monster and married him while he sits on death row waiting his execution. He currently is in San Quentin, California, and I think he's infamous because one person stalked an entire county in California, of all places, Los Angeles. He just had nothing but malice and no compassion and just murdered people. So, that is my speech on my infamous or famous person. Although he's not really famous, but he is definitely infamous, and he definitely instilled the fear of anything in people in California in the 1980s. So, the end.